The day I rolled back into my lakeside driveway felt like stepping into a stranger's nightmare rather than my own property, because before my tires even crunched the gravel I saw 5 folding tables, 2 blaring speakers, and a giant HOA banner flapping above the dock, as if they had declared victory over my land and crowned themselves monarchs of my lake. And standing right at the edge of my porch was Karen herself, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, arms crossed, sunglasses reflecting my truck like twin daggers, barking orders into a walkie-talkie about ticket sales and wristbands while glaring at me as though I were the intruder. For 10 surreal seconds I thought I had made a wrong turn because my quiet retreat had turned into a carnival, but the wave of adrenaline and anger that rose in my chest quickly reminded me this was mine. Every plank, every stone, every ripple of water out to the farthest buoy, and the audacity of seeing strangers splashing in my cove and children lining up for paddleboats without permission gave me that moment of perfect clarity you get before a storm when you know the lightning is about to hit. I parked slowly, deliberately, keeping my eyes locked on hers, and the crowd that had been laughing went silent as if someone had pressed mute. The only sound left the faint slap of water against the dock, and I realized this was going to be a showdown that could make or break the peace of this entire community. I stepped out of the truck, and the smell of grilled hot dogs mixed with gasoline from the rented jet skis was an insult to everything I had built here years ago. Karen stomped toward me in her crisp white blouse and HOA badge lanyard swinging like she was on official duty, and she snapped that this was private property under association jurisdiction and that I couldn't park here without paying the day-use fee. I let her rant for a good 30 seconds, her voice rising higher with each accusation, and only then did I calmly hold up my keys and my old deed folder, the one with the embossed seal from the county clerk that had never failed me. Her eyes flicked to it and then back to my face with open disbelief. Around us, the crowd of renters and guests started murmuring, phones out recording, smelling drama. I walked past her without answering and put my hand on the old oak post at the start of the dock, a gesture both possessive and steadying, feeling the sun-warmed wood under my palm. This dock had been mine before the HOA even existed, and in the years since I had gone away for work I had trusted that my paperwork and my posted signs would keep it safe. Clearly Karen had decided my absence meant weakness, and now she was treating my lake as her playground. I turned and asked loudly who had authorized this event. She launched into a speech about community access rights and how my old deed couldn't possibly still be valid under new zoning, but her voice cracked halfway through when a man in a fishing vest near the shore muttered that he'd seen my name on the county plat map. I smiled inwardly, because I had known from the moment I drove in that my next move would change everything. I pulled the deed all the way out and unfolded it slowly so everyone could see the official stamps, reading aloud the legal description that included not just the parcel where my cabin sat but also the water rights to the entire body of the lake. The effect was instant. People began whispering and pulling their kids from the water, looking nervously toward Karen as if she might have been lying to them all along. She tried to laugh it off, saying I was bluffing, but her voice trembled. I took a few steps closer and lowered my tone, telling her I had been generous for years but now she had crossed the line by hosting an unauthorized event and selling access to property that was not hers. I could see sweat forming at her hairline despite her sunglasses. A sheriff's deputy who had been enjoying a corn dog by the concession stand came over when he heard raised voices. He asked to see the paperwork. I handed it over calmly, my heart pounding but my face perfectly still. Karen tried to intercept but the deputy stepped between us, scanning the pages and nodding slowly. The crowd was dead silent. Then he handed it back to me and said in a low voice that from what he could see, this was all mine and that anyone without my permission was technically trespassing. That one word, trespassing, landed like a thunderclap across the dock. Karen's bravado cracked completely. She sputtered about calling the county commissioner, about special easements, about a meeting scheduled next week, but it was too late. The guests were already packing their coolers, some looking at me apologetically, others glaring at her for misleading them. I simply stood there watching the exodus as if the tide were going out, my grip still on the oak post. Deep inside I felt a surge of satisfaction, but also a strange sadness that it had come to this public spectacle instead of a quiet conversation. Yet part of me relished the timing because revealing the truth so dramatically in front of everyone meant I would never have to repeat myself again. As the last jet ski sputtered off and the inflatable slide deflated on the shore, I walked back toward my truck, aware of every camera phone still aimed at me. I knew this was only the beginning of the fight, that Karen would try to regroup and strike back with meetings, paperwork, and maybe even lawsuits, but for now I had reclaimed my ground and reminded everyone what the law and the deed really said. The hook was set, and the lake itself seemed to shimmer with anticipation of the storm that was coming. The following morning the lake lay eerily quiet, its surface a sheet of silver under the early sun, but I could feel the pressure building beneath it like a current because Karen had vanished overnight only to return at dawn with a clipboard, a megaphone, and a small army of HOA loyalists in matching polo shirts. They clustered at the edge of the dock, as if preparing for a siege, whispering and pointing at my cabin while she paced in front of them, clearly orchestrating her next move. I watched from my porch, coffee in hand, thinking about how quickly this had escalated from an unauthorized party to a full-blown territorial standoff. I had anticipated retaliation, but not so soon and not so theatrical. As I sipped the bitter coffee, I heard her voice crackle through the megaphone, announcing a community emergency meeting to discuss my so-called illegal occupation of the Lakeside property. The words floated across the water and struck me as both ridiculous and dangerous. Karen was building a narrative, and if I didn't counter it carefully, she might sway some neighbors who didn't know the law or my history here. I set down the mug and walked slowly to the dock, noting the way her people shifted nervously when I approached. She stopped shouting and glared at me. She was dressed for battle in khaki shorts and a windbreaker with the HOA logo, hair pulled back tight like a drill sergeant. She tried to hand me a printed notice declaring that the association would hold an emergency vote to revoke my access to the lake, claiming some obscure bylaw gave them authority. I glanced at it without taking it, then calmly pulled out my phone and called the county records office on speaker. The ring tone sounded loud over the quiet water, a small but deliberate show of confidence. When the clerk answered, I asked her to confirm my property boundaries and water rights in front of the assembled crowd. The clerk cheerfully read the legal description aloud. Karen's face stiffened, and I could see her fingers tightening on the clipboard until the paper bent. I decided to escalate strategically. While Karen barked something about outdated paperwork, a white pickup truck pulled up near my cabin and out stepped a sheriff's deputy accompanied by a county environmental officer. I had called them the previous night, anticipating exactly this scene. The officer carried a rolled-up survey map and a tablet, and the deputy kept a neutral expression but nodded to me as they approached. Karen rushed over to them first, unloading a stream of complaints about me fencing off public land and threatening community safety. The officer listened politely, then turned to me. I handed him the deed and the water rights documentation. He unrolled the map and compared it with the tablet's GIS data, right there on the hood of the truck, tracing the boundaries with a gloved finger. After a long moment, he looked up and said in a clear voice that my documents matched the county records and that the lake was indeed private property with me as the legal owner. A ripple of gasps moved through Karen's ranks. Karen tried to recover by claiming that even if I owned the lake, the access roads were maintained by the association and therefore she controlled ingress and egress. I smiled faintly because that was the card I had been waiting for her to play. I reached into my folder and pulled out the secondary deed, the one granting me not only the land but also the access easements established decades ago when the original homesteader built the first road to the water. The deputy read it quickly and raised his eyebrows. Karen's face drained of color as she realized she had no leverage left. The officer stepped aside and began taking photographs of the unauthorized signs and rental equipment still littering the shore. I walked down to the waterline where a few of Karen's people were hastily pulling up ropes and stacking chairs. Speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear, I explained that while I had been gone I had trusted the community to respect the posted rules, but instead my absence had been exploited. I said that from this moment forward access to the lake would require my direct permission and that any future violations would be treated as trespass. The words were simple but carried weight. Phones came out again, recording every syllable. Karen sputtered about lawyers and said this wasn't over, but her voice had lost the commanding edge it once held. As the county officials wrapped up their inspection, they handed me a copy of their incident report and advised Karen to dismantle any remaining HOA installations immediately to avoid fines. I thanked them calmly and watched as they drove off, leaving Karen standing at the dock like a queen whose castle had dissolved overnight. She turned to her people and tried to rally them with promises of a legal battle, but they looked at her with doubt now, whispering among themselves. The quiet of the lake returned, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the peaceful retreat I had known but a charged silence full of tension and grudging respect. That afternoon I walked the perimeter of the property, checking the old boundary markers and taking fresh photographs. It struck me how easily power can shift when people see clear evidence rather than rhetoric. Karen had relied on intimidation and repetition to build her control, but under sunlight and official maps her empire crumbled like a sandcastle. Still, I knew she wasn't done. She had pride, influence, and a talent for spectacle. If she couldn't win with paperwork, she might try something louder. I stood on the dock as the sun dipped low, the water glowing gold, and thought about the next move in this strange chess game. The lake was mine on paper, but public perception still mattered, and Karen would surely try to twist the story to her advantage. That meant I had to be ready not just legally but also strategically, because the real showdown was only just beginning and I needed to be the one writing the next chapter rather than reacting to hers. The next weekend dawned with the kind of heavy sky that promised a storm even if the forecast said clear, and I sensed before I even opened the blinds that Karen was about to try something desperate. Sure enough, when I stepped onto my porch, there was a flotilla of brightly colored kayaks and pontoon boats anchored just off the dock, blocking access like a living barricade, and at the center of it all stood Karen in a sequined life jacket, bullhorn raised, television cameras pointed at her from a boat with a local news logo plastered on the side. She was staging a spectacle, calling it a community reclamation of public waters, and her voice boomed across the lake accusing me of hoarding natural resources and evicting families from their favorite swimming hole. For a brief second it almost looked like a festival, but the tension in the air, and the way her eyes darted nervously between the cameras and my cabin gave away the truth. This wasn't celebration, it was a last-ditch bid to control the narrative and humiliate me before the county could fully settle the matter. I took a slow breath, letting the humid air fill my lungs, and reminded myself I had been planning for this moment since the night of the first confrontation. I walked down to the dock and raised my hand to signal I would speak, but Karen drowned me out with the bullhorn, shouting that I had 30 minutes to leave the property voluntarily before the HOA reclaimed it. The absurdity of the statement was almost funny if it hadn't been so public. Phones and cameras everywhere captured the showdown. Rather than shout back, I simply gestured to the far side of the dock, where a banner now hung, one I had quietly installed that morning under the cover of darkness. Private Lake Festival, sponsored by the owner. Beneath it, a crew of workers I had hired bustled about setting up grills, a small stage, and rental kayaks, all bearing my name. It wasn't just a countermeasure. It was a declaration that I wasn't retreating but expanding. The sight of it threw Karen off balance. Her bullhorn wavered as she processed what she was seeing. Then I unveiled the trump card. I pulled out a laminated letter from the county commissioner's office granting me full authority to regulate all access points for environmental preservation and safety, a letter I had secured after weeks of quiet lobbying and careful documentation of the HOA's unauthorized activities. Reading it aloud over a portable speaker, I explained to the gathered crowd and the cameras that effective immediately all activities on the lake required my written permission and that violations would be subject to fines and removal by county law enforcement. As I spoke, 2 sheriff's boats appeared from around the bend, lights flashing but sirens off, gliding silently across the water until they reached the flotilla. The deputies on board addressed Karen calmly but firmly, informing her that she and her participants were in violation of private property and environmental regulations. Karen tried to rally her people, shouting about freedom and public rights, but the crowd's energy had shifted. Some began paddling back toward shore, others deflated their floats and stowed their paddles, sensing the tide had turned. The cameras swiveled from her to me as the deputies began handing out printed notices. I stayed on the dock, arms crossed, projecting calm while inside my heart raced from the adrenaline of watching months of preparation culminate in this moment. It was a strange mix of triumph and disbelief that it had all come to this theatrical climax. When the flotilla finally broke apart under the gentle but firm escort of the sheriff's boats, Karen was left nearly alone on her pontoon, bullhorn sagging in her hands. The cameras zoomed in on her expression as she realized the story was slipping from her grasp. I stepped forward and, in a level voice, invited her to come ashore and speak privately. She refused, muttering something about lawyers, but the offer itself made me look like the reasonable party and sealed her public defeat. The deputies issued her a formal warning and advised her to leave immediately to avoid arrest. She shouted one last defiant promise that this wasn't over, then gunned the pontoon's engine and sped off, rooster-tailing water behind her. As the crowd dispersed and the cameras packed up, my hired crew lit the grills and the scent of barbecue drifted across the water. Guests who had received my prior invitation began arriving by car and foot, filling the shoreline with laughter and music. It was a surreal transformation from confrontation to celebration, and for the first time in weeks I felt the tension easing from my shoulders. I greeted people, explained the new rules, and watched as children splashed under parental supervision without chaos or trespassing. The lake felt restored to the place it had been before all the drama, yet somehow stronger and more truly mine. Later, as the sun dipped and painted the lake in molten orange, I stood alone at the edge of the dock, looking out over the water that had been the center of so much conflict. I thought about the irony that Karen had given me the public platform I never would have sought on my own. Her theatrics had become the stage upon which I secured not just legal control but also public perception. The cameras had captured her meltdown and my calm authority, and by the time the news segment aired that night, the narrative would be set in the minds of thousands. I could almost feel the weight lifting from the community, the resentment melting away as they realized the lake would be cared for and accessible but under clear, fair rules. I took a deep breath and let the cool evening air fill me with relief. This battle had started with a mind-blowing hook of chaos and trespass and ended with a quiet but decisive reclamation. I knew Karen might still try lawsuits or petitions, but it wouldn't matter. The law, the public, and the lake itself were on my side now. I walked back up the dock toward the glowing lights of the festival, and for the first time in months allowed myself a smile, knowing that peace and ownership were no longer abstract rights on a piece of paper but living, breathing facts rippling under the sunset.